I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's podcast. I've come to the realisation that my podcasts are just as long and just as full of information as my podcast, so at some point next year I'll probably scrap the podcasts and just stick with releasing a main podcast each week. I started out doing the podcasts every other week because I wasn't sure I'd be able to fill a whole main episode every week, but as it turns out there are more than enough topics and more than enough amazing people to talk to. And actually, if I had more time, I could probably release an episode every day and still have a backlog of content. I just need to figure out a way to update the website and add a search facility, which I can't do myself, and I don't have the money to pay someone to do it, so that'll be something that gets done as and when. So on to my guest this week, and as it's Halloween in 2 days' time, I'm speaking to Jo Ferguson, and we're talking about bats. Jo starts by explaining her role as the Built Environment Manager at the Bat Conservation Trust. Can you explain a bit about your work and the work of the Bat Conservation Trust?
Sure. Okay, so a bit of background. So the Bat Conservation Trust was set up in 1991, and we're the only charity that really focuses on conserving bats and the landscapes that support them. We're UK-wide, but our sort of core staff and our National Bat Helpline, which is the free advice service we have for householders, we're based in London. We have a Welsh officer and a Scottish officer, and the rest of us travel quite widely. We're sort of only at peak times a core of about 35 staff with a UK remit, so it's quite a big job for us. So we kind of get most of our work done through partnerships and projects working with other organisations. So that's kind of how we get our UK spread, I guess. For me, the Built Environment Project has been running since 2007, and it was it came to a bit of a crunch point where we realised that we really needed a specific project or work programme to look at sort of the challenges for bats in the built environment, but also, a lot of the opportunities that the sector presents. And so I manage this work programme. So my focus is really, as you would expect, raising awareness in the industry on bats as a protected species, but impacts and sort of controlling for those impacts. But also we've got loads of great partners and projects where we're actually looking at enhancement for bats in the built environment, because really and hopefully this will sort of come out as we chat, when we're thinking about enhancing for bats, we're thinking about enhancing for invertebrates, so therefore pollinators, so therefore there's the knock-on benefits to things like birds and other urban wildlife. And then obviously the big thing for me is kind of that where it benefits people, because bats they're a bioindicator. So really where you've got bats doing well, it kind of indicates that the ecosystem that you've got locally is doing well, and that's it's obviously to the benefit of the plants and wildlife, but also as there's this huge well-being agenda, we really understand now the impact of a good natural environment on our own sort of physical and mental well-being. And so for me, that kind of, it brings together a lot of the things I'm passionate about. Sort of urban ecology and being in towns and cities is where people are. And if we can get that connection with nature, it benefits the wildlife and it benefits people. So although mine is an industry focused job, the nice thing about it is it gives me scope to take those skills, and I do a lot of voluntary work as well. So what the project does is I'm involved in sort of running a lot of research projects which help us improve our knowledge of bats in the built environment. And then I kind of take that work to partners. So people like the Landscape Institute and REBA, Royal Institute of British Architects. We look at producing best practice guidance documents. And then the big step is, okay, how do we get that information out there? So things like this. So blogs, podcasts, articles. I run full-day training courses. I sort of lecture in universities, and also we have trade shows as well. So it's quite a big spread that I manage, and a lot of what I do is kind of taking the temperature within industry and talking to my colleagues and looking for those points where people are saying, actually, we think this is going to be a real issue, and then trying to jump in there and support industry through this. So yeah, it keeps me busy, enjoyable, challenging. never dull. So it's what you want, really, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. No, it sounds great. Well, actually, I also feel like I'm winning because I've got bats in my house. So I've got
Seriously,
good
that's
ecosystem.
fantastic.
Yeah, that's brilliant. But that actually brings me nicely on to my next question, which was my bats live in my loft space. But where else do they live normally?
So this is a good question, because obviously the built environment is, it's a big place, and kind of one of the main issues is the built environment has overtaken the natural roosting sites for bats, and so that is kind of one of the issues they've had to adapt to. So traditionally, bats, including the bats in your roof space, would be roosting in trees, and sort of ancient veteran trees with these lovely big hollows and cracks and crevices, which we don't really see anymore, or using things like the cave systems, which they've been disturbed through man-made use, or maybe they've been gated, maybe they've been sort of excavated out. So you've suddenly got the loss of habitat and kind of increased levels of disturbance as well. So for many of our bat species, the man-made environment has been essential for roosting sites. All of them use man-made structures at one point or other during their life cycle, and it's sort of worth saying here that bats don't use the same roost all year round. So the bats that you've got in your roof, do you normally see them in the summer?
Yeah.
So summertime is where bats are looking for a really nice, warm, dry place to raise their young normally. So the mothers will come together and crash the babies, and they'll want somewhere which is even ridiculously hot as you poke your head into your roof space in the middle of summer, and it's like 35 plus. But that's really, it's really fantastic for them, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to feed, and then they're trying to take all of that energy from their food and just pass it straight on to the pups. So the mothers want to produce the milk, pass it on to the pups. They don't want to waste any of that energy heating themselves. So we have this really interesting thing where people are putting up bat boxes, for example, and they're thinking like bird boxes, you want to have them on the cool side of the tree or the cool side of the building. But actually, bat boxes for summer roosting want to be somewhere really hot and sort of south-facing. But the flip side of that is in the winter, when they're hibernating, they'll use somewhere completely different. So they'll have somewhere that's cool, that's humid, and they'll be saving energy. They'll be dropping their body temperature to sort of down to about 2 degrees, and taking a breath a minute, and basically slowing all of that sort of energy rich sort of energy sapping activity, and they'll just wait it out really sort of November to March, which sounds great actually given the weather that we've had recently. So and because there's no food for them as well, so the food disappears, the temperatures drop, and they slow everything down. So the bats that you've got in your roof sort of in the summer, in the winter they'll go somewhere completely different, and that means that they need a lot of different resources sort of in the built environment. So warm roof spaces to sort of cold cavities in walls, things like that, and they'll be kind of constantly moving.
So I mean, I live on the edge of an oak woodland, so is it possible they're going into the woods in the winter?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, it very much depends on the management of the tree. So it would have to be trees that are big enough with, those lovely large damp kind of cavities, that when they're inside the cavity, they're not getting that temperature fluctuation. So one of the equivalents for them we find is spaces in tunnels, really long tunnels, ex-railway tunnels, where in the middle the air is really still, and you've got this little microclimate, and they can sort of put themselves into little crevices on the surface of the brickwork, because you're not getting that fluctuation in temperature. They're not exposed to the weather, and they're not exposed to predators. So we kind of spend a lot of time looking at what they would be doing in the natural environment, and then looking into the built environment and saying, well, what replicates that?
And are they hibernating during that time?
When they're in the tunnels, generally, yes, because it's so cold and damp, but it's constant. It's that lovely constant temperature for them. So it means that they're not getting, and this is sort of one of the issues for them at the moment with things like climate change, they're not getting that peak of warmth that basically tells them to wake up. But obviously that is a major issue for our bats now. We're getting these warmer, wetter winters that bats are being woken up by the warm temperature, thinking it's spring, coming out and finding no food. So a lot of the work I do with the built environment looks at, okay, what are our impacts and what can we do? But we've also got other projects running in the Bat Conservation Trust looking at, well, what are the impacts of climate change and things like that? How is that going to affect how our bats can successfully hibernate?
Okay. How many species of bats are there in the Britain, and what are the more common ones that we might see?
So most people are surprised to learn we have 18 species resident in this country. And generally speaking, the further south and west you go, the greater the number of species. So places like Devon and Cornwall and South Wales are kind of real hotspots. And the rarest species tend to be associated with the rarer habitats. So things like blocks of ancient woodland, limestone cave systems, which again, you have more sort of at that end of the country. But the ones that we're most likely to see sort of in our gardens, allotments, those kind of spaces, sort of our most widespread and abundant species, the common and soprano pipistrelles, and they tend to be the ones that people have most heard of. But they are our tiniest bats. So the adults are only about 4 grams in size. And people, will get calls to helpline where people think they've found baby bats, but these are actually adults, and they just happen to be, quite fast flying, so they can duck in and out of the habitat. They can kind of get away from predators, which means that they can kind of tolerate the harsher habitats in our cities. And they're the ones where you might see them. People often describe them to me sort of going round and round and round, say a tree in the garden or a bush, somewhere where you're getting insects gathering, and they have this sort of really flittery figure of 8 kind of circling flight. And it's one of those things where people quite often think they're looking at birds, and then it's a question of getting your eye in. And once you see them, then you'll kind of see them everywhere, because we've got them all through central London. For example, I've done a bit of work doing monitoring work in and around Victoria Station, and we've recorded 6 species there. So so they're really, they're really starting to, because they've had to, the faster flying species in particular, adapt to our urban areas.
Is it normal to see them flying in the daytime? Because I have seen some that look quite large, actually, but they've been out in the day, and I've thought, is that right, or is that normal for some of the species?
They shouldn't really be flying about in the day, kind of due to this sort of risk of predation. So in the same way that bats are light shy, being out in the day kind of, it leaves them open to predation from things like hobbies and sparrowhawks. And actually, we're finding, we've had records in places like London where the peregrine falcons are doing really well, that peregrine falcons are actually now hunting bats under lit conditions. So ideally they shouldn't be out during the day. But things like, we were talking about sort of climate change and warm weather and stuff. So we quite often get calls in the winter, or photos sent through sort of to the helpline and stuff in the winter when it's become warm and bats are disorientated and they've come out. And the other time is when they've been disturbed. So if bats have been in a roost and somebody's come in, and either it's building work, or they've started doing pest control treatment, something like that within the roost space, and bats haven't been considered, then the bats might fly when they feel like they're under threat. So ideally they shouldn't be. But like you say, some of the larger bat species that fly faster, they do feel that threat of predation less keenly than the slower flying ones. So they're the ones that I guess would be probably at less risk of predation.
Okay. Well, you mentioned lighting, and so I'm guessing that does have a detrimental effect on their normal habits. So can you talk a bit about that, and maybe some of the other bigger challenges that are facing bats at the moment? Yeah,
sure. So big focus for us over the last few years has been looking at the impact of artificial lighting on our bat species. And I think we can all appreciate how bright our night skies are now, but actually the stats are quite scary. So there's been some work done using satellite data, and between sort of 2001 and like sort of 2016, you've got a sort of an increase from like 19% light polluted skies to around 99% in some areas of Europe and the US. So those kind of like pristine dark skies that our bats need are just are sort of ever dwindling. And I guess it kind of helps to put it into context. Now, I found this out only last year. I went to a talk on bats and evolution, but there are sort of bat fossil records, skeletons coming out of Eastern Europe from about sort of 50 million years ago that are kind of recognizable as our bat species flying around now. So people sort of say, oh, well, they're adapting to our cities and maybe they're evolved, but they have evolved. They've evolved to be these like perfectly adapted nocturnal creatures. And then within the space of, you think about the last 50 years and the rate of urbanization and lighting, we've kind of changed everything for them. So I talked about like fast flying species and slow flying species. Obviously the faster flying species, they're going to be able to get away from predators a bit better, and so they're the ones you tend to find in our cities, crossing gaps in vegetation, things like that, feeding in and around light, but kind of opportunistically, because some of the lights that are out there, especially the ones with a high UV content, are sort of a real draw for insects, and they can really kind of create like a vacuum effect. They're like a point light source in the environment, and you'll get insects being drawn from all this lovely dark habitat where the bats are to cluster around these lights. And so you've got the slow flying species which can't access this food resource, and it's like a real double impact for them. So you'll find them sort of falling away when you get into the urban environments. But even the fast flying species who are they're taking a big risk, kind of all coming together and trying to feed on these insects and opening themselves up to predation. So yeah, there's a number of different aspects to lighting in terms of the type of light you use and where that lighting might be that can really up the amount of impact. So, our first advice would always be try and avoid lighting. If you're creating this lovely garden or habitat or green space, and during the day, it looks fantastic and rich with insect life, but at night when the lights are on, it can turn it into a real desert. So it's being mindful of how it's sort of that night day contrast, I guess, really.
And what would predate the bats at night if they were by a light source?
So at night, or certainly it tends to be, the risk times are like dusk and dawn.
Right.
So having lights kind of almost extends the period of day. So where you'd get things like peregrine falcons or sparrowhawks, hobbies, it gives them an extra bit of time, and then you have that overlap with bats. Bats are trying to come out and feed, and you get that big upswell of insect just after dusk. So and historically it would have been also things like owls as well. And we find a lot of the quite intelligent bird species, so things like our corvids, so crows and jackdaws, things like that can work out where bats are coming and going. So when they're coming out of a building, if there's a bit of flat roof to stand on, there was a video going around not that long ago showing them just basically sitting there,
picking them off as they came out. I think it was a seagull, the one that I saw doing it.
Seagulls as well. Anything that's again, those kind of opportunistic feeders where they're where they're kind of working out, how can I do this for the least energy possible? Likewise, they're leaving the roost is just unfortunately a bit too easy for them. But the biggest predators that bats actually have are cats.
Oh, is it?
That's the biggest issue for them. And while lights, I don't know that any work's been done to say either way. Certainly, making sure that cats are in at dusk and dawn, that kind of key period, is another good way to sort of protect bats, and kind of another risk that they're up against, unfortunately.
Have their population numbers dropped over the past, since you've been sort of monitoring?
So sort of over the real drop has sort of been over the last 100 years, things like intensification of agriculture and land clearance and the sort of increase in pesticides, that kind of, all of those impacts coming in. Some of our populations, we'd sort of estimated they'd dropped by about 90% over the last 100 years. We've been monitoring 11 of our 18 species, and in recent years, through the National Bat Monitoring Programme, we've been seeing a stabilisation in all of those species and an increase in 3, but it's a long way to go before we're back where we were, and that's after bats have been fully protected under UK legislation since 1981, and we're only now kind of really starting to see the conservation benefits. So it is, it's in that respect, it's a positive message that things are changing, but we have to be really mindful of where things were, and there's definitely still work to be done.
Have you got any ideas about why those figures might have stabilised?
Things like understanding the legislation and the awareness work that we do, people understanding their impacts now, and having those kind of the stuff I work on, which is kind of having fail safes and systems and stuff in place within people's normal line of work. So where you have risk registers for buildings, for example, knowing that bats is one of the things that you need to be aware of, even though they've been protected since 1981, there's still, in some places that information missing. So I would like to think it's to do with the, the conservation work that's being done, not just by us, but at large. We've got a number of sort of fantastic organisations, bat groups, certainly volunteers out there, getting that message out there. But yeah, it's still, with any statistics, you've still got to be mindful that there's a lot of other stuff going on that we probably still haven't got a good handle on.
So you mentioned the laws that exist to protect bats. Can you just give a brief overview of those? Yeah,
sure. So our bat species are all fully protected under both international and domestic legislation, and very loosely it protects the bats from harm themselves. It protects against destruction of their roosting places, because we've already talked about kind of how important those are for them raising their young and for hibernating, and they need those very specific conditions as well. So again, the protection we're talking about here, it protects the bats, it protects their roosts, but it also protects their roosts if they're not present at that time. So if bats give birth to young and then they leave that roost, if that roost is then destroyed, even if the bats aren't harmed, then they've got nowhere to come back to the next year. And it might mean that they're less successful in raising their young, that they have to go somewhere else. So a lot of the understanding to do with why their roosts are protected is to think about how, they each of those roosts performs a function as part of their life cycle, and you kind of remove one of those pieces, and it might be that bats can't breed that year, that they don't raise young because they only have one pup a year. So if you don't enable them to be able to successfully raise that pup, then again, that's one of the reasons the populations had crashed so drastically, because they're so vulnerable to disturbance. And this is particularly true of when thinking about hibernating and female bats. So, there's lots of weird and wonderful things about bats, but one of the really interesting facts I like is that they mate in the autumn, but the females store the sperm inside themselves, and then only if they've had a good winter and they've got enough body fat and they can sustain a baby, will they get pregnant in the spring. So they're only pregnant once a year, and they're only for one pup, and sometimes it's not every year either. So people do see bats quite frequently now in our cities, and we are talking about the stabilisation of their populations, but they're so vulnerable. It's kind of on a knife edge. It doesn't have to be a couple of rough winters, a disturbance of a maternity roost, and suddenly that whole area might, their population might really crash. So it's kind of understanding their ecology, which is a lot of the work that I do sort of with industry.
God, I had no idea they only had one population.
Yeah. This is it. I think a lot of people, you see them, see pictures of them and stuff, and you think, oh, it's it looks like a rodent, and superficially they do, but their life cycles are kind of nowhere similar, really. You've got a mammal. It's a really strange thing. Again, they book the trend. Essentially, the bigger the mammal, the longer you live, and that tends to be a nice, neat kind of chart. Apart from bats have this really weird spike, and you've got mammals that are like 4, 5, 6 grams in size, and certainly the last recorded oldest one in Eastern Europe was 41 years old.
Wow.
So yeah.
Who
so you've got these
thought?
I know. So you've got so there's all that stuff that goes with it. So they have these roost sites that they come back to every year, and they have all these foraging sites and commuting routes that they use. And more than likely, they're passing all of this on. They're very social animals, so they have this whole layer of ecology that if you didn't understand that, you'd think, well, yeah, they can pick the populations up. Surely they can just have a litter of young, and then you start to see the sort of vulnerability in the way that, in their ecology, and you start to understand really how they can be impacted so severely.
Yeah, definitely. So if people wanted to encourage more bats into their gardens, particularly if they're living in urban sites, obviously keeping the lighting down or off at certain times is important. Are there any other things that people can do?
Yeah, so I think what's quite nice is, I mean, obviously I'm always talking about bats, but really what I'm thinking about is urban ecology as a whole. So what's good for pollinators and other invertebrates, so insect-rich habitats, bug hotels, but obviously plants that are really good for them, nectar plants, but with a bit more of a focus as well on sort of the night flowering plants and scented plants, so things like evening primrose and jasmine, anything that attracts moths really. That's a really sort of favoured food by things like the brown long-eareds. And another really good thing, again, good for wildlife, good for bats, is some kind of water source, and that can be really small. You can get a small number of insects, because what we're talking about in our cities is, due to the less sort of food than maybe some of the sort of optimum habitats, you're talking about a lower density of bats, and you're talking about mobile animals as well. So I think a lot of people think, oh, I'm in my cities, I can't create these huge gardens and produce all of these plants, but actually what we're really talking about is creating stepping stones, so everybody can do something small. And I also like to say, thinking about bed and breakfast as well. So if you're putting up bat boxes, put something in for them to feed on, and if your neighbours are doing something similar, or a local public green space is doing something similar, then you're starting to join those dots really. You're starting to create these networks through the urban environment, and that's kind of what it's all about really.
And what's the biggest thing they eat? Because I was thinking, when you were saying about ponds, I've got a pond, but I seem to attract more than anything huge, great big dragonflies, which probably way more than bats. But what do they eat? How big do they go when they're feeding?
So you're probably talking up to large beetle size, like cockchafer, that kind of sort of size of beetles, and especially you're talking. So some of the larger bat species, so the greater horseshoes, sort of like 35 grams, something along those lines. And again, they're also associated with what would have been the old pasture. So you'd have had dung beetles and things like that. But obviously with the pesticides and that removal of food, but you're seeing that change over back again to sort of organic farming, and reduction in pesticides. So you're getting some of those natural ecosystems back. So you're getting some of those bigger prey items, and therefore you're getting some of those larger bat species back in as well.
Oh, that's brilliant. I mean, they can come to my garden and eat as many cockchafers as they like, because I hate those. They're just awful when they start flying, and I know that's terrible.
And they got clattering into things.
Oh, smashing into the window like they're trying to break in. Just horrible.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. You've got basically, for kind of each size of flying insect, you've probably got a bat. You've got a bat species, that's going after it, and that's true of them worldwide. So the last count, 29th of July, there were 1,406 species of bat in the world.
That's a lot.
Yeah, a huge number, and it's just like they're just plugging all those niches where there's a food source for them. They've adapted to be able to exploit it, which is really fantastic.
Would they eat a stag beetle?
I think they might be. I think that's probably their limit. They probably are a bit big. I say that though, the greater horseshoes do have a really decent set of teeth on, and some of the larger bats as well, to get through those kind of carapaces. So you never know.
Ooh, yeah. Well, not that there's a lot of them around for them to eat, but
and ideally they wouldn't be going after another protected species. That's where things get a bit awkward. So ideally they'd be going for a slightly smaller beetle.
Right, stick with the cockchafers, that's fine.
Yeah, exactly.
So this episode's going out around Halloween, and I can't resist asking the silly question, will they get caught in our hair, or will they give us rabies? Because I'm sure some people still kind of ask themselves those questions.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I do, and one of the things I always say at my training courses and my talks, is there are no stupid questions when it comes to bats, because I think there's so much mythology around them, and because of that, there's fear, and there's kind of like Chinese whispers, and people do kind of, some of these myths do really persist. So bats will fly really close to people. We get them, you've seen it probably camping and things like that, when you get a cloud of midges around you. So what they're trying to do is just get to the insects. We're like a little heat source in the environment, and they're using this amazing echolocation system to be able to get as close as they can to pick off the insects and to not get caught in our hair. That's not to say it never ever happens, but I suspect 99% of those stories are he said, she said type of things, because they do get very close. And I know sometimes people get unnerved, but equally they are, when you actually see slowed down videos of them in flight, they are so incredibly maneuverable. We've got a fantastic video that I always show in my training courses, which is one of our species, the Natura's bat, taking a spider off a spider's web. It comes in and you can see it working out which side of the web the spider's on, and then it comes in and manages to pluck it from the surface of the web. So that's the detail that they're getting. So they're really, really trying not to touch you, basically. Yeah, and similar for sort of the rabies. So we are classed as a rabies-free status. We don't have the classic rabies virus here, which is associated normally with dogs. We do have a rabies virus, which is found in an incredibly small number of our bats and only certain species. So we have what's known as a passive surveillance program. So if somebody finds a dead bat anywhere, it gets sent to the Animal Plant Health Agency, and that's members of the public or bat workers. And they've tested over 15,000 UK bats over the last 33 years, and less than 30 of them have shown that they've had this virus. So basically, they avoid contact with humans. They're not normally aggressive. So if you don't handle bats, it's not an issue. But also to say, if you found a bat that was injured or grounded, you can wear really thick gloves to get them into a box, and then you can ring our helpline number, and we'll provide those details. And we're here to give you that advice. But essentially, if you're not working with them like a bat worker, on a regular basis, then there's no risk to the public. Yeah.
Are you doing anything to around Halloween at the Bat Conservation Trust?
We've got. I mean, I guess the sad time about it falling at the end of October is that pretty much all the bats will be in hibernation. So we're in the process now of kind of doing our last bat walks and talks, which is a bit of a shame. A lot of what we do now is getting people to think about, I guess, what you can do in the spring. So activities wise, we're sort of saying to people, well, they're going to be asleep now, when they come back in the spring, and talking about sort of planting for them, constructing bug hotels for the food, making bat boxes. We've got a really simple sort of plan of how to make one on our website. So we're kind of looking forward already to the spring, and then we've got loads of sort of fundraising ideas on our website as well. I mean, really is the sky's the limit. We have people doing all sorts of amazing stuff, making amazing cakes, fancy dress, all sorts of. So people really throw themselves in. So this is kind of our Christmas, Halloween. It's our favourite time of year. So there's lots of stuff on our website. But anything, we always just say anything to bring people together and kind of celebrate them. They're fascinating and they're unique, and there's still, like we've discussed, some of these myths persisting, but they really need our help. And I think once people start to learn about them, and once people see them up close as well, so I'd say keep your eye out for, we've got some amazing bat carers in the UK, and some of them will be going along to sort of presentations, and they'll have bats that they have in their care that can't be released. And once you see them up close, it completely changes your perspective. So I would sort of challenge anybody to, even if they are still a little bit unsure about bats, then, please check out our website and find out more about them. And I would hope that it would change your view.
Thanks, Jo. Yes, if you're scared of bats, or even if you don't know much about them, get yourself over to the Bat Conservation Trust and find out more about these amazing animals and how the BCT are helping to encourage more back into our landscapes. I had an interesting chat with Jo after we stopped recording, and I was telling her about the bats that live in our roof. And she said if you have any concerns about bats living in your house, particularly if you're concerned about things such as accessing your loft space if there are bats there, or if you're thinking about having building work done, you can ring the Bat helpline, because it's been set up to not only answer questions you might have, for example, if you found an injured or sick bat, but also to help homeowners who may be sharing their homes with bats. And they can even come out and have a look at any bat roosts and advise you if they've got the personnel available. So it's an amazing resource. And of course, I've listed the number in the show notes, but if you'd like to jot it down now, it's 0345 1300 228, and that's a UK number. I just wanted to say thank you too for those of you who've recently reviewed the podcast. They've been lovely, and you're very kind to take the effort to do that, and I very much appreciate it. Also, a bit of housekeeping. Twitter hasn't been sending me notifications or notifying me of new followers. So if you feel like I'm ignoring you, please do send me a DM or shout at me via email and let me know you're there. I'm always happy to chat. Finally, thank you to Claire Vokins for recommending I chat to Jo. Claire is an excellent wildlife gardener, and I interviewed her way back in episode 2 about garden maintenance. So if you're interested, go listen to that or check her out on Twitter where she's at CE Vokins, and I'm sure you'll be entertained by her tweets. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.